Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, how you doing?
Doing well, man. How you been?
I'm all right, man. So I was looking back at our first conversation, which was episode 105, and this will be episode 203.
Wow, getting them in.
Yeah, and this was about our first conversation was about a year ago, and in that conversation, you know, I mentioned, how I discovered you. You were on Kevin Samuels. You were on his show being interviewed,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, and so I kind of I followed up and I figured out some of the other stuff that you were doing. And I need to personally thank you for your tireless advocacy for black men and boys.
Oh, wow.
You've been an inspiration to me and have helped me to more clearly articulate issues of which I have long wrestled.
Oh, man. I appreciate it. It's been happening with me too, man. It's it's interesting looking at these issues and trying to really explain what black men and boys are dealing with. It feels more like going back through my own past than it does developing something new for the future, because it really
Yeah.
comes down to excavating experiences that I know other black men resonate with, and then asking the question, what exactly is this? Because when you don't have anything else to measure it against, you just say, well, that's just something that happened to me. But then when you start talking to other black men and find out this is much bigger than just something that happened to me one day, and you really get to the core of it, you find that it usually has some pretty serious, implications. And once you're able to say it clearly and put it out there, to see the number of black men that come in response to that, saying, yeah, I've had that too. It's mind blowing, man. It's humbling, it's mind blowing. And then this is real. This is real.
Yeah. So I know you probably noticed in the let's see here. I guess it's going to be as you're looking at the screen, the right corner. There's a, a certain character that's got some sunglasses on with a certain hat on there,
Right.
uh, and that's your merch, uh, and it says I am a black masculinist.
Yeah, man. Yeah, man. I'm wearing the
And
shirt right now, as a matter of fact. So,
that's what's up, man. That's what's up.
so I appreciate that.
So let me ask you the question: what is a black masculinist?
I'm glad that you asked, because there's been so many people that have all kinds of opinions, and much of it comes from people who are either familiar, somewhat familiar with black feminism, or deeply rooted in it. And so, at its worst, it's viewed as a knee-jerk uh, reaction to feminism that's not worthy of discussion. At best, I think some people just regard it as finally something, an answer for what black men deal with. But if you go to new black masculinities, wordpress.com, and you click the about section, there is actually a definition. And what I say is black masculinism is an intellectual, a political, and an analytical research tool. In other words, it's an intellectual and political movement, but it's also an analytical slash research tool that centers black males across age, class, and sexuality, and seeks to frame the actual state of black life, black male life, in measurable terms. Advocating for black male studies, we endeavor, let me just move this around. There we go. We endeavor to empirically contextualize the major pillars that indicate black males' quality of life: carceral treatment, criminal and civil sentencing, leading causes of death, health, employment, income, wealth status, education, violence, intimate partner homicide, rape, housing and homelessness, types of labor, political approaches, wealth, family court impact, fatherhood, forms of protest, marriage, and the history of institutionally based treatment. These are just the beginning points of the analysis. I call for black masculinism to highlight black males' lives beyond society's assumptions, often rooted in stereotype and based on shorthand information, slanderous media representations, and even personal grudges. So, in other words, it is actually the gesture, the movement, both as a movement unto itself and a research tool to actually accessing and studying what Black men go through, but what can also be measured and studied. And the reason we had to do that is because there's been so much conjecture, there's been so much stereotype rooted in how Black men are viewed. Much of it comes, the legacy of it goes back to racist scholarship, most particularly, during the Enlightenment era and all the way through, the rise of pseudoscience regarding Africanity. A lot of it was tied to Black men in particular, all the way through the mid 20th century with the subculture of violence theory. And this was theory produced by racist scholars with no empirical backing, and then picked up by Black feminists in the 1970s and 80s and used as the primary language to define Black men. So you had the Black feminist movement defining itself against this so-called oppression that came from this Black male image established by racist white scholarship with no empirical backing. And so by the time we get to the current moment, what we've seen is that tradition, further, kind of pushed through media, pushed through entertainment, pushed through stereotype, to such a degree that we are, considered monsters, boogeymen, and all these other kinds of things, even within
super
the Black
predators.
community. Super predators. It's been, we've seen that with Hillary Clinton. It's had political ramifications, but it's even had, communal ramifications where you have Black feminists, you have women themselves and families who are framing the Black men in their lives against these traditions, against these concepts. So Black masculinism is really the attempt to use empiricism to say, wait a minute, let's push all that aside and actually look at what the data says about Black men. And that's what Black masculinism generally refers to. Now, on a more generic level, yeah, a lot of it has to do with Black men defining themselves outside of these, influences, even the influences we have in our own families and our own households, and really asking the question, what does it mean to be Black men? And can we answer that from our own experience rather than what we've been told to say about what it means to be Black men and boys? And so there's a freedom there that I'm hoping we can push for, where that freedom of expression allows for a truth that doesn't make it to popular culture, that doesn't make it to popular media. It doesn't even make it to the freaking academy in terms of how Black men are often assessed.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Yeah. I heard from you, speaking of the academy. This is the first time that I heard this statistic. 20,000 fewer Black men in the academy than Black females. We're talking about faculty members here.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's an old number.
Yeah.
And I have reason to believe that number is likely expanded.
Yeah.
Okay. So what caused this? Now, part of this is sort of a simple question that, I think people know the answer to, but what caused this, and do you think it is likely or even possible for this disparity to change?
Well, starting with the latter question first, it would take a massive, genuine movement that is targeted on uplifting Black males for that to even be a remote possibility. And the problem with that in the era we live in is to target boys in any kind of positive way is seen in and of itself as an act of misogyny, an act of sexism. If we go back to, as an example, Barack Obama's push, right, My Brother's Keeper, the very first response I noticed wasn't from racist white folk. And I'm not saying racist white folk didn't have a response, but the first response I noticed came from mostly Black women. And they had it wasn't a poll, it was a, what do you call it? A petition that they were putting around online where they wanted people to chastise Obama for not setting up an organization for either Black women and girls or including Black women and girls in the dynamic, even though the White House had an office for women and girls. There wasn't one for men and boys, let alone anything for Black boys. Now, of course, Obama ended up turning it into something for Black and brown boys. You can't ever just freaking have something for Black males. But at the end of the day, it was Black women that attacked Obama on this. because the first inclination they had was that girls were being left out. But again, this is why Black masculinism seeks to go with the data, because Black women were operating off.
Thank you so much for watching my video so far. If you'd like to support, there are several ways to do so below. Also, likes are free. Please comment, share, and subscribe. Now back to the video.
With the data, because Black women were operating off of a feeling that they have that Black girls are ignored, but they weren't looking at the data as to who was graduating high school, who were going to college, who were working white collar jobs, who were working at all, who were unemployed, who were homeless. They weren't looking at any of that data, which was the basis, for why Obama, made this generic gesture. Now, it wasn't federally funded, it was philanthropically funded, but women were incensed that they didn't have a similar organization, even though they have, better standing than their Black male counterparts. And they could comfortably live in both realities, where Black women and girls were doing better, they had more support, and then at the same time chastise anybody that tries to do anything to improve the quality of life for Black men and boys. So that said, to answer your question, if there's going to be something to improve the quality of life for Black boys and men, it's going to have to take a targeted, focused, push. But when that push is constantly denied by Black women more than anything, see, this is what happens. White liberals will take that. And white liberals say, well, if Black women oppose it, then it must be wrong, right? Because their jump off point for what should happen with the Black community tends to be Black women. And that's mainly because women in and of themselves across race, drive 70 to 80% of consumer purchases in a given community. And when you factor that alongside, electoral participation, Black women, tend to vote to a greater degree than Black men, but that's mainly impacted by incarceration. So Black males are disenfranchised as voters, but that's interpreted as Black women needing to be the point of reference for making decisions in regard to the Black community. So that said, that leaves us on the outs. Now, the first part of your question, you remind me what that was. You were saying,
yeah, the first part was just, what caused this in the first place? This 20,000 fewer.
Well, generically we can say white supremacy, but if you look at how white supremacy applies in the situation, a lot of it comes down to K through 12 education. And when you look at K through 12 education, where the data, suggests that at some stages of it, you have over 90% of the teachers being female. And then as you get up toward, finishing high school, that number drops a bit. But the point being, the overwhelming percentage of teachers across race are female. And there's data to suggest, especially if you check Thomas D's work at Stanford, that girls do better under female teachers, boys do better under male teachers. And so under that dynamic, if the majority of teachers are females, then it stands to reason that there'll be a drop in performance from males, or a diminished performance in comparison to girls from males across race, which is what we're seeing, right? So there needs to be a push for male teachers. I would argue there needs to be a push for male schools. But when we've seen that in the Black community, it's been hotly debated back and forth about whether it's justified. There are many mothers who see the need for it, but it's often fought against by liberals and even by some Black women who oppose, again, for the same reasons they do for Obama's My Brother's Keeper, any focus on boys that doesn't include girls, right? Even though girls don't need it, that's unnecessary to point out, right? So that being said, boys tend to not do as well. What we see is boys do okay in terms of college, in terms of high school graduation as it pertains to GEDs, because you need those to get into certain types of blue collar labor, which is more practical, more straightforward, yields and income more quickly. College, you're talking at least 4 years, and then you got to go find a job, and then you might even have to take loans. So it's a longer, slower process. So we find boys tend to do their GEDs to a greater extent, but not graduating with high school diplomas and competitive GPAs that will allow them to go into college and compete. And a lot of that is because there's a lack of identification with teachers, there's a lack of support. And then we also know that Black boys tend to be put into special ed to a greater degree. And there's much documentation to suggest that this has nothing to do with intellectual performance. It has everything to do with behavior, has everything to do with social relationships, and it even has to do with implicit bias. Nevertheless, these boys don't find their way out of high school with the kind of record that makes them competitive. So it tends to be girls. And we know as of 7 years ago, black women, young Black women, were the most enrolled in higher education across any demographic. That support doesn't yield itself to many Black males. So these are the ones graduating high school. They're going to college, where again you have a plethora of Black females, especially of females, excuse me, especially in the humanities, all the way up to graduate school. So it's not surprising to see that Black women have a greater number of degrees, let alone graduate degrees, and they're going back into teaching more readily. So that said, since 1976, Black men have half the college degrees of Black women. We also don't have as much, school loan debt, but it is what it is. And so when you're talking about, higher level, faculty service, it's overwhelmingly going to be Black female. And that also bleeds into electoral politics. A lot of people don't understand. You're going into electoral politics, you'll rarely find candidates who don't have a college degree, right? So if Black women are getting more college degrees, and they have been doing so for decades, it's one of the reasons you shouldn't be surprised as this last wave and continuing wave of electoral politicians are going to more, readily be female than male.
Now, goodness. So Black masculinity studies,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to Black feminist studies.
Okay.
Now, one thing that I heard you say was empiricism,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, I heard you in a live stream. You might have been on. You might have been doing a live with Green Gorilla. Shout out to him. And where I think you mentioned that there's more of a the point here is to rely on the numbers, whereas it seems as though a lot of the Black feminist studies are not necessarily relying on empiricism, not relying on numbers, but are going by perceptions or whatever. And you more or less said something like that. If you could talk a little bit little bit more about the differences between those two sort of
Sure.
studies.
Oh, okay. So how to put this? All right. So I had a colleague of mine that came to Fresno State. Now, this is a full professor in Africana Studies. She came to Fresno State and she gave a presentation that was supposed to be on, I think it was Black couples. It was supposed to be something. She changed it at the last second without any feedback from anybody else. Like, she just changed it. Now, I wasn't a part of the organization that invited her, but I knew her. But nevertheless, she changed it to, she wanted to critique Black patriarchy, right? And in doing so, she gives this lecture, and the lecture is a critique of what she considers Black patriarchy and its oppressive nature, right? The only I think it was 3 pieces of evidence she used. One piece was a picture of Snoop Dogg, who had a woman on a leash. It was I don't know what he was doing. It was some award ceremony, some event that he went to, and somebody snapped a picture with him and some woman on a leash. The second piece of evidence she offered was that Black men eat the big piece of chicken at dinner. The third piece of evidence that she offered was that Black women were the only group that had hair discrimination. Now, I was so stupefied, I couldn't even respond. Now I didn't have data on those 3 things per se, but I still never imagined I would see something like this in the academy. So, when I looked at it afterwards, of course, everything I suspected, was erroneous. I mean, the whole question of using one person, one celebrity as some reflection on Black men, that's just problematic just in general. Like, you don't even really need to go much further than that. If you're going to make an argument about Black men using a picture from one Black celebrity, that's disingenuous in and of itself. It's an argument posed in bad faith. The whole question of the big piece of chicken, I mean, really, it's a misnomer, but it comes out of a time period, especially in the 70s and 60s, where you had Black men doing more hands-on labor, and their system required more. But at the end of the day, to make that an argument about Black men was idiotic, And then the last thing, as far as hair discrimination, you can go back to cases going back to the 60s where Black men within the military and within police departments were filing lawsuits about beard discrimination, hair discrimination, so on and so forth. So, but she made these arguments and got a standing ovation from an audience of female students. And one of those students was mine, right? And so she approached me the next day and she was so excited about the lecture and whatever. And I remember asking her, prove to me that white patriarchy exists. And she ran off 10 different points without stopping, without breathing, everything from home ownership to political representation as electoral politicians to, leadership roles to income. She just rattled them off, bam, 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 bam. And then I said, okay, prove to me that Black patriarchy exists. And she just didn't have anything to say. Now, mind you, this is one of the people that was giving a standing ovation to this person's lecture, because she knew that after railing off those 10 points about white men, the big piece of chicken didn't stand as an argument worthy of something being espoused in the academy.
Who are you to eat the big piece of chicken?
See that? You see that? But you talking about men that worked, in construction and digging in mines. But anyway, so my point in bringing all of that up, man, is that when you look at how Black feminism, Black women's studies has kind of framed Black men in far too many instances, it's been rooted around a sense of oppression, a sensibility, but not often rooted around data. And when data has been used, it's been very specifically cherry picked to reflect the dynamic we see between white feminists and white men, right? And so, and this is one thing we noticed white feminists did, especially after 1968, they started to get some policy acumen, some policy momentum. One of the things they did is they tried to make space. They tried to offer women of color a position, most particularly Black women. This is one of the things that fundamentally undermined the civil rights movement. And by explaining or trying to seduce Black women with this idea that they were women first, they were more oppressed by their womanhood than by their race, seducing Black women into a position of fighting patriarchy, right? Even though Black men don't hold any such patriarchal status over Black women like white men do over white women. There's no parallel relationship there. So this is the one of the things you see. What Black women will do, Black feminists in particular, when they're making these feminist arguments to justify fighting the Black patriarchy, they'll talk about individual experiences with abuse. They won't necessarily talk about an income gap. You'll hear a few people say that, but that's easily dismissed. If you take Black men's earnings and you add them to incarcerated Black men, we become the only group that earn less than our women. We earn 51 cents on the dollar. I believe Black women earn about 63. Employed Black men are said to earn 68. But again, we go down to 51 when you include incarcerated Black men. So that said, you'll find that many of them in casual conversation will start pointing to things like abuse, because the idea is that men are stronger. So men abuse women more readily, and Black men must do so more than anyone else because they're boogeymen. But again, when you look at the data, this is why we keep going back to this in Black male studies, abuse in the Black community is bidirectional, meaning it's even coming from both directions. And if anything, LGBT abuse is higher than everybody's. But to the extent that it is bidirectional, you still find data that supports the notion that across race, women initiate violence to a greater extent than men do. Nobody wants to talk about that. Women use weapons more often and more directly than men do, right? And this is often framed by feminists as self-defense, but there's data to challenge that as well. It's not about self-defense when they're initiating violence, right? And these are the kind of things that we're starting to pull from under the rug about the real existence of Black men. And that's why this push has to remain empirical. So we don't delve into feelings and frustration, but rather, we look at what the data says, which is one of the things I would argue Black women's studies could have done more of, but sought to really double down on these stereotypes of Black male boogeyman. And that's one of the things that has to be challenged. So that's what we try to do.
All right. So I have a program called Thunder's Thoughts, and it's my live streaming program. It's on Thursdays at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Okay. And fairly recently, I did an episode uh, called Multiculturalism plus the deregulated dating market equals divestment.
Mm.
And my point here is that in the way that multiculturalism is practiced, with a committee of elites deciding which aspects of the considered cultures will be fully embraced,
Mm.
you only ever really get a version that has been co signed by the dominant society.
Okay.
Due to byproducts of the feminist movement, the incentive structure for relationships has been distorted, which has facilitated the worst outcomes of the Pareto principle in the
Okay.
dating market. In order for minorities to rise, since racism is a misandrist in nature, the women will necessarily date men from the dominant society.
Mm-hmm.
And since women are usually more susceptible to cultural features of their mate, even the minority women will begin parroting racist sentiments about the men that share their reflection.
Mm.
In the black community, there is a rise of divester groups which seem to regularly parrot neo-Nazi talking points and can only be described as hate groups.
Mm.
How, now, after saying that, how does the black manosphere differ from divestors or even black feminists in your estimation?
Okay. So feminists, and for the most part, have been sanctioned in the academy. I mean, for the most part, the majority of feminists that you'll meet, white or black or otherwise, have generally been college educated, right? So this is an ideology that is sanctioned in the white ivory in the ivory tower, and it tends to come with a certain type of class perspective. Um, now you said there was three entities. It was feminists, the manosphere, and what was the third?
Divestors.
Not divestors. Okay, well, and divestors really strike me as an offshoot of feminists.
Black feminists. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
but again, it's very much a class experience that comes out of college, right? The thing about them, and that's the differentiation between womanists and feminists, or at least it used to be, where you had this group of womanists who didn't necessarily have a college education, but saw themselves as part of the community rather than as women, separate from the community, right? So they saw themselves as part of the Black community, and part of their logic was we were both on slave auction blocks. So, why am I arguing with, whether or not Black men oppress me when they don't have the means to? But there's been a kind of dying off of the womanist perspective. We don't hear it much. And so feminism amongst women in particular is kind of taking the day. But it's very much a college framed kind of dynamic. The manosphere is actually a very different thing. It doesn't come out of the university. Many Black men in the academy find themselves hampered, find themselves incapable of speaking up, have to worry about losing their jobs, have to worry about not being hired. And this is something I've experienced, and other Black male studies scholars has experienced, where their publications, their perspectives, even their free speech is used to criminalize them. And they're not worthy to be hired in many ways. Excuse me. So what we tend to notice is that Black men in the academy have had many different types of thoughts, but generally don't share them publicly. Whereas the manosphere is really more a collective of brothers from the ground up that come across using social media to articulate their perspectives and work on ideas over the course of years. Right? Bringing Black men's experiences to the fore, having conversations, debates, sometimes very spirited debates about what Black men's goals should be, what our aspirations should be, how we should engage with women, what our political concerns should be, so on and so forth. It is not sanctioned by the academy or any other institution, but it is happening in a free space. And this is something we didn't have in the 70s and 80s and the 90s and even the early 2000s. We didn't have a YouTube. We didn't have a Twitter or a Facebook where men could actually articulate themselves. But Black women had not only the academy where they could be supported as Black feminists, but then they started to have access to Hollywood, right? Where they started to have access to publications and various publishing presses, so you had this whole slew, especially in the 70s and most particularly the 80s, where Black women are publishing, creating films, creating, academic books to fiction, texts, all of this sanctioned by institutions that we don't control. Black men at best had hip hop. And there were many hip hop artists that tried to create a space to speak for Black men. But the problem is you had this wealth of Black male experience being filtered through by the late 1980s, a small collective of fairly young men who are trying to say a few things here and there about Black men. But even in hip hop, we didn't conceptualize the issue on gender terms. Much of it was filtered through the individual life of the performer. Whereas when Black women like Terry McMillan or Oprah Winfrey or Bell Hooks, whether they were in the academy in Hollywood or writing fiction, they were speaking for their whole gender, race, demographic, right? So hip hop attempted the best it could in various instances to respond to these issues in regard to how Black men were being conceptualized, but it wasn't the best apparatus to do that. By the time you get to the mid to late 2000s and beyond, Black men start going to social media themselves, and they start comparing notes about family court, about law enforcement and their criminal sentencing, about relationships with women and the extent to which they're being taken for granted or exploited over resources. When Black men finally started to compare those notes without the supervision of any group or the authority of any major institution, the largest institutional impact we have is maybe some of the policies YouTube has over language or something like that. But short of that, it's an incredibly free space for Black men to actually start getting on the same page, or at least articulating themselves. And this is what led to my work online, right? Where I've never in my lifetime seen Black men who are everything from the most conservative, right-wing, Republican Party voting Black men to the hardest core revolutionary Pan-Africanists, to the, some of the Hebrew Israelite, some of the Moorish, cats who don't even claim American citizenship, every extreme I can think of. I'm hearing Black men come together on one thing: their experience as Black men, their treatment by the society, their treatment in their own regions, and even their treatment in their own families and households, most particularly by the very women they live with, who have been supported much differently than we have. So this is why I use the term colonizing agents when I talk about Black feminists, because, and it's not even just Black feminists, it's Black women who aspire to participate in society in a very particular way where they can be rewarded with middle-class access. Often the price of that reward is to criminalize Black men. And so Black men of all of these different ideological stripes are coming together in a space. And I'm not saying they agree on everything, but they are at least coming together in a space that recognizes, and it probably is one of the very few spaces that recognizes that Black men live a different life. And it's not a life that we actually get to, have a strong influence on in terms of institutional impact, but it's one that we have to endure and respond to. And so you have all these Black men from different orientations debating about what needs to be done, but I've never seen that in my lifetime. I've never seen it. So, to go back to your question, the Manosphere is a space where you have men from divergent backgrounds coming together to discuss and debate the quality of life for Black men and what the solutions should be. And I don't know too many other spaces, if any, that have allowed that opportunity. And it's off-putting for some because, especially if you're talking about women who've had access to certain institutional support, who've been able to talk amongst themselves for years. I mean, goodness, just between the 80s and 90s alone, I mean, we saw film after film, book after book, college, on college campuses, discussion group after discussion group about what men were doing wrong and what women needed and what women, but you really couldn't find spaces where men could have those discussions and, without us being supervised and told what was considered inappropriate, so on and so forth. Very manicured And I've done this. I've actually organized Black male groups from high school through college, and even as a faculty member, developing programs for young Black male students. And at every single turn, at every single level, I've been pressured by the institution, and I've been pressured by Black women to be, quote unquote, more inclusive, which I took as a code word for them to have other people in the room. And when I've allowed those people to come in the room, they try to change the nature of the discussion so that Black men cannot even vent or articulate their issues without being browbeaten into supporting agendas that fundamentally ignored them in the first place. Even feminist terminology, right? The kind of concepts that we heard in these classes that were not developed with men in mind. And we were told that we needed to take these concepts and work with them and try to better understand them so we could find our place in them. And most of the time, our place in them was as oppressors to women, and Black women in particular. But none of them encapsulated our experiences. And we didn't have the means to develop programs where we could actually do that. That's what Black male studies is. But in truth, the only department of Black male studies in the world is in Scotland, other than the online institute that I've started, instituteforblackmalestudies.com. Short of that, you got to go to Scotland to study with Dr. Tommy Curry at Edinburgh University to engage a mostly African-American based Black male analysis in Black male studies. It's not been welcome in the academy. So yet again, we've been relegated to institutional spaces that don't allow us to have the conversations we need to have. And those are some of the major differences.
Now, I interviewed Rollo Tomasi. Shout out to him. It was episode 200.
Okay.
And in our interview, he advocated for a more integrated manosphere. So it seems, though, to me that there is a need to have a Black manosphere because our issues are so different.
Mm-hmm.
But I would also argue that there are some things that are in common. I spoke a little bit earlier about a deregulated dating market that's had an impact on practically all men. I think aspects or byproducts of the feminist movement have had impact on all kinds of men. This sort of negative language about masculinity, this whole toxic masculinity business,
Mm-hmm.
has been, I think, negative towards all men. So, what do you think of this, a more integrated manosphere? Do you so he even said that he thinks it's a mistake to have a sort of separate or sort of segregated Black manosphere, as it were. So, what are your thoughts?
I think that's a bit Pollyanna. Look, here's the thing. If you're going to actually have a genuine conversation between different groups of men, most particularly between white and Black men, it's not going to work if we're not going to be honest. Now, the separations we're talking about, they didn't develop because groups of men strategized the difference. The way they developed is that you had Black men who were participants in what we now call the white manosphere. Whether you're talking about Obsidian, whether you're talking about Juan, Valdez, Angry Man, whether you're talking about BGS, Black Gnostic Speaks, they were participants in the manosphere. And one of the difficulties they had is when they were trying to talk about their own experiences as men, but most particularly also as Black men, right? Because our legacy is different. And as much as some people want to dismiss, slavery, they want to dismiss racism, so on and so forth, the reality is you can't, because those experiences aren't just historical, they continue. So the status of Black men today, the lack of wealth, Black folks have 2% of the national wealth, right? The lack of inherited resources. How are you going to inherit something when you have 2% of the wealth? The ongoing, bifurcated policies that frame Black America and put us in a lower status, those things cannot be brushed away because they're inconvenient. But also along that, as you have Black men participating in the manosphere, when they try to talk about their experiences and the impact of racism, because if you're going to talk about incarceration or relationships with the police, you can't sidestep racism because some people don't like the term. If you're going to talk about, acquiring employment, if you're going to talk about even being an entrepreneur, building a business, and yet doing so in a space where you're not able to secure capital or loans the way others are. You know what I mean? Whether you're talking about the Jeff Bezoses, whether you're talking about the founders of Apple or Windows, or, when you're looking at these big name billionaires who had family, who not only could contribute hundreds of thousands of dollars, but also had family resources and relationships to politicians to create policy to allow them to advance and build what they're doing.
Right.
You can't have those discussions if we're not going to be honest about the institutional exclusion of Black males, even on the ground level, right? Where, most Black men could not really, build the kind of platforms early on that we saw white men building. So anyway, but all that aside, what I'm saying is, if you're not going to be genuine about that dynamic, then you're going to have the same thing that took place in the Manosphere, which is where Black men got tired of not being able to express themselves and tired of white men who, really couldn't identify with their experiences, and if anything, chastised them for it. So they left and they created their own spaces. Most particularly when you talk about people like Angry Man and BGS, they've left, created their own spaces where they could have these conversations in a way that was a bit more unfettered. Now, by unfettered, that doesn't mean that everybody is singing in the same choir. It doesn't mean that everybody agrees. But at the very least, Black men could have an honest debate with one another about their experiences without having to deal with white men who knew nothing about race, but were quick to dismiss it. If anything, white men in the Manosphere, they saw discussions about race the same exact way they saw discussions about feminism, right? They kind of treated Black men in particular, but men who talked about racial difference much the same way that they talked about feminists. And so, that many Black men found that to be a disingenuous kind of approach to this. And so if you want to kind of have a combination of the two manospheres working together, there's gonna have to be some honesty about that shit. But the reality too is that, we haven't really seen that. I mean, we've seen elements of the white manosphere that's been very supportive of certain type of racist approaches to perceiving Black men, and Black men are not really going to support that. But this is part of an ongoing thing for Black men, because we were legally not considered men. Going back to the 17th century and whatnot, we weren't considered men by policy. So this isn't just an arbitrary thing that started. We started noticing a couple of years ago. This discussion for Black men has been going on for generations. This is one of the reasons why men in their 80s used to come up to Kevin Samuels in tears and give him love, because he was articulating something that they could talk about then. I mean, even when I was first reading about the Manosphere some years ago, much of the experiences that I saw white men furious about in terms of like divorce and child support judgments, Black men have been going through that shit for decades. We were talking about it for decades. We just didn't have a space where we could do it. White men kind of noticed it later, especially if they were middle class, and they were frustrated, of course, justifiably. But there wasn't, there wasn't a qualification for the differences in our experience. And I think in many ways we saw this happen with feminists. We saw white feminists, seduce Black feminists, politically and ideologically. And then there was a huge split in the really late 70s and early 80s in many ways between second and third wave feminism, where, you had these various women of different racial groups, different orientations that took issue with middle-class white women of the second wave, who for the most part ignored their experience. And I think Black men in many ways learned from that. And we looked at that and we said, well, we're at the precipice of having the same kind of split here, but we're not going to invest in it the same way, Black feminists invested in feminism and ride white women's coattails to create policy that only worked to our advantage. Black men didn't do that. We didn't attack the white manosphere either. We just created a space where we could have conversations about our experience, without being dismissed. But if you go back and listen to those early discussions, if you take someone like BGS and go to some of his MGTOW channels, where he was in conversation with white men, you could see some of the reasons he left and went off to speak from a different vantage point. So, but to go back to what you were saying about Rollo, it's a bit Pollyanna. If you're going to do it, you're going to have to be honest about some things that, I don't think comes very easily in some of these circles. And it is what it is. And then you have to now factor in money, because now people are making millions off these discussions. I mean, Kevin Samuels was making like $500,000 a month these channels were building. But
Goodness
Kevin was
gracious.
Kevin was the only one that broke 1 million subscribers in the Black Manosphere. But
Yeah, but wait a minute. He didn't even have $1,000 to his name when he died, though.
man, that is such, it's one of the things I've talked to Dennis Sperling about. Not that was hardly the case. He was actually doing really, really well,
Oh, of
in a
course he
number of ways.
was. If he was making 500,000 a
Yeah,
month
come on,
in Google AdSense,
right?
then of course he has more than $1,000 to his
And,
name.
and,
It's
and
totally
you
ridiculous.
you and I both know that doesn't even include donations. That doesn't even
Oh yeah,
include side projects.
Patreon or anything else. Yeah,
No,
there's a bunch of
Patreon,
stuff. Yeah,
individual donations, or I
Cash
mean,
apps.
remember
Yeah,
Cash Apps, but he was also still doing private consulting. And he
yeah,
was, men that were close to him would tell you he was working around the clock. I mean, he was
yeah.
consulting with people in Dubai, all over the world. At 3 a.m, he's up in a suit doing individual consultations, and he charged what he was worth. So yeah, I mean, even if he lost every dollar he had up till the last month he was alive, he still had more money than a lot of people would see in their entire lifetimes. So that was just
Right.
fool. But but what my point was in bringing Kevin up though was Kevin is the
Right.
only one in the Black Manosphere that broke out and had over 1 million subscribers, and that doesn't even include the million plus he had on Instagram. But we've seen white men in the Manosphere, more than one, who've been able to do that kind of thing, and so there have been some radical splits as far as that. And it's going to require some soul searching to actually have that discussion.
Now, one thing that is definitely in common between the white manosphere, the black manosphere, is there's a lot of criticism levied at the manosphere spaces for being very critical of women, for saying all kinds of really, edgy stuff that you're not allowed to say in public, kind of stuff about women.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and my now first of all, I would say, of course, there's all kinds of stuff that gets said that I definitely would not condone. It's not stuff that I would say. I think people should have the right to say what they want to say, and they should be able to vent if they, you know, say you've been married for 10 years, you find out that your wife's, been cheating on you, and two of the kids that you thought that were yours actually were the kids of this other guy. But you still have to pay child support. She gets to stay in the house, and you're staying in your car, and and you get online. Probably the kind of stuff that you say is probably not going to be, you know, it probably will have a particular edge to it, and I think it's good for men to have a place to be able to vent. Now, maybe I'll argue that, okay, at some point it needs to become more constructive, I suppose.
Okay.
That would be my personal angle on it, but I don't I don't have an issue with someone. I support the right for people to be able to express themselves and talk about the things that they want to talk about, the way that they want to talk about, with who they want to talk to,
Okay.
and considering the fact that the space is not for women.
Mm-hmm.
You're not the audience, right? So
Right.
women are not the audience. The audience is the men. Now, if women want to come in, obviously it's totally open, then you can, but you need to understand that you're not the target audience for the conversation that takes place. But I said all that to say I did in BGS calls them Car Thunder. So now I have a Car Thunder playlist on my YouTube channel.
Right.
And I did a stream called he chastises whom he loves.
Okay.
He chastises whom he loves. I would argue that a lot of the sort of criticism of women is not a sign of hate. It's actually a sign of love. I think that very much so. A lot of the criticism is because especially in the black space, it's because we really want to see our communities repaired. We we love the black community. We love black women. We to a fault we do,
Mm,
right? And in our sort of expression of a having an issue with certain kinds of behaviors that we see all the time is
mm,
not because one that we think that all of them are that way, or two because we hate women. It's not
right,
that at all.
right.
It's because we love women, and in the he chastises whom he loves. That's right out of the Bible.
Mm,
If someone doesn't has no criticism for your behavior and sees you doing all kind of wild and crazy stuff,
right.
that is a better indication that they don't care about you at all.
Hmm.
So, what do you think of all? I mean, I said a bunch of stuff, but
Well,
what do you
no,
think?
I think, and this is something we've commonly heard people talk about, but I think it's still true. The opposite of love is not hate, it's apathy. It's
Yes, yes,
disconnection altogether. So when you see black men completely just gone and unconcerned, which I kind of, as a father of a 17-year-old, I'm seeing a younger generation of men that are far more, removed than I've ever seen. I mean, I'm Gen
yeah.
X. I'm Gen X. I
We're the
grew up.
same age, have the
Yeah,
same birth month.
there it is. I mean, we grew up at a time where there was still a sense of race loyalty.
Yeah,
I'm not seeing that with the younger generation. They've grown up watching what we've been through, and they're like, nah, I'm good. So everything
yeah,
from the video game heads to the what I call the Bronnies, like LeBron James's son, where they're just kind of checked out. There's a very different experience on the horizon for the black community. But when you look at the manosphere, you're talking about slightly older men than that, all the way up through their 60s. So and these men are, as you say, they're having these conversations because there's still a connection there. Whether they're happy about it or not, there's still a connection with black women, and some are fervently clear about it, and some less so. But you're right; it's very much attached to a desire to see some aspect, some permeation of the black community thrive in some kind of way. And so that's where a lot of this frustration comes from many of them, who are grappling with these issues. And yeah, it needs to be understood. But also, we need to factor in what I was saying before. We didn't have any vehicles for our perspectives. So and being the same age, you can remember sitting in a movie theater watching an Oprah Winfrey film that cast black men as monsters. And what voice did we have to respond? What mechanism could we use to get our voice out there to say that this is problematic? I mean, you got Oprah Winfrey and Steven Spielberg telling us about black male boogeymen, but what could the average black man do to respond to that? We didn't have a response. There was nothing we could really do. So that being said, when black men finally do have a space to respond in, you're gonna get 40 years of pent up criticism. But but even that is often dismissed as, oh, that's just sexism, that's just rage. No, that in and of itself is a disingenuous dismissal. There are viable, justifiable critiques that have not been given stage. They've not been given a platform for to be heard. And so when I hear women say, "Oh, well, you guys, that's just a bunch of sexists over there," I'm like, you're really not participating in anything that's going to help, because at the end of the day, you can't tell black men who've been forced to be silent for the last 50 years to shut up. And when they say something, just dismiss it as sexist. No, you actually have to listen if you want any repair. It's kind of like a marriage gone bad. If you've ever been in a bad marriage, if there's going to be any hope of reconciliation, you're going to have to hear shit you don't want to hear to reconcile with this person. Now, if you don't want to hear it anymore, feel free to go, but understand what comes with that. You got to look at your age. You got to look at the dating market. You got to understand your position. And if you're ready to do it, then do it. But if you don't listen, it's going to be a split on the horizon, which may be better for everybody involved, may not be. At the end of the day, it hasn't happened yet. And so black men are figuring out how to say what's on our minds. We're working that through. We're developing our own vocabulary to do it. And it really wasn't until Kevin that people had to acknowledge publicly that this was happening, that these discussions are happening. And we're seeing more evidence of it. I mean, I talked tonight on my show about an article that came out of the LA Times, I think yesterday, if not today, talking about why black men are not voting Democrat. And I'm not conservative. I'm not on the right. And in many ways, I may lean a little left, but I'm not technically on the left. I'm an independent. And I pulled away from both parties because I saw neither working in the interests of the black community, let alone black men. But my point in bringing that up is, we're seeing this article come out written by a black woman, criticizing black men. But there's a point where she actually does interview a few black men to find out why. And when they start to explain why they're withdrawing from the same role we've always played, she disingenuously dismisses their concerns, but she at least wrote a few of the things they had to say. I'll give her that credit. She at least listened. She at least wrote a couple things. She didn't go further and investigate them as a journalist should, but she at least put them on the table. And I think that was an admittance of what the Manosphere and I separate the two in a way, because here's the thing: the Manosphere is an extension of black men in a way that we don't often think about. Like, for example, I've known brothers who were SYSBN since the late 80s. And these were Pan-Africanist nationalists. And they didn't, they were not, they were against being with white women, but they went and found black women from all over the world. But the reason they were doing it is because they were frustrated with the treatment of black men by American black women. So the Manosphere comes about not as something that determines black men's direction, but as a reflection of the kinds of ideas, thoughts, and debates that black men have been having for decades. We just didn't have a major black platform to congregate on. But every major ideology in the Manosphere has already been in existence in the black community for decades. We just didn't have a hashtag, we didn't have a name, but brothers did it. I mean, I tell the story all the time. When my wife passed away in 2009, I looked around at all my friends and close associates, and there were about 29 of them. Only one was with an American black woman. Two were monks. And we didn't even use the term monks at this point, but they were monks. They disassociated from women altogether. And all of the rest were with women from different cultures and backgrounds. And only one was with a white woman. So going against the popular, kind of depictions of black men's mating choices by often black feminists and many black women in general, oh, they just want white women. No, the majority of my colleagues and friends, it wasn't that they wanted white women. They wanted women who were cooperative and who respected them, who, more to the point, who came out of a culture that had a respect for masculinity and the masculine role in the family. And in African-American culture, I would argue that misandry is very deep-seated, deep in the culture. It's been handed down across generations, especially when tied to policy that excluded black men from being able to provide support and provisioning for their own families. We saw black men as individuals put in a position where they had to compete with the United States government. And for the average black man who's dealing with consistent, unemployment, most particularly after deindustrialization, difficulty finding employment, let alone employment that could pay, that could really pay the bills. You had individual men competing with government and institutions that black women had access to that most of us didn't. Well, most of us couldn't compete. And so you saw that kind of, deep-seated misandry taking root in families then, and it's been passed down. So now you got women who've seen grandmother, maybe even great-grandmother, mother, themselves and their daughters all in female-run households. And there's a passing, low-key disdain for black men. I mean, Kevin called it a low-boiling contempt, a one-way aggression for black men. He talked about it often. And black men knew what it was. Women tried to argue that it didn't exist, but even black men who were feminists that didn't want to hear anything the Manosphere had to say, when you listen long enough, they would at least admit that they've had the same experience. Their argument wasn't that black men didn't have these experiences. Their argument was we should still fall on our swords and be chivalrous when it comes to repairing the black community. We should still follow this kind of gynocratic framework. But they didn't necessarily argue that black men's concerns didn't have any merit. They just didn't like the interpretation of what many black men are starting to come to. But my point is
Right.
simply that this shit is real and black men are tired of it, even in their love for black women. And they've tried to offer the olive branch to the extent that as we're getting these ideas out, if you really want to repair relationships, you need to acknowledge the stuff we're saying. And all of that culminated in Kevin Samuels. Kevin Samuels, once piercing the mainstream, became the focal point and the voice by which many in the manosphere's ideas were reflected through. And he was in many ways, people couldn't comprehend the cacophony of voices in the manosphere. So they listened to one. And they had serious problems with what he had to say. But at the end of the day, he laid it out there very clearly. And Kevin was one of the few that could do that across class. Kevin could talk to the upper black women's class and he could talk to the street. Not a lot of us had that kind of range. Most of us operated on whatever class level we live on. And for the most part, although men across class may listen to us, women was a whole different matter. Kevin was one that could talk to men and women across race and class while still advocating for the black community and advocating more particularly for black men. Very few people could balance that many balls in the air. And many will critique how he did it and how he could have done it better. But at the end of the day, he was, very few could have got to that level doing it. Very few have. I don't know if anyone else has necessarily. But it's not to say that Kevin created this in a vacuum. He listened and pulled from a lot of different men about this. And once he articulated it, you saw everything went apeshit. People went crazy because they could not reconcile how to deal with what he was saying. And then more to the point, they are finding themselves shocked at how many men and young men support the kind of stuff that we're hearing. That's kind of stuff Kevin was saying that we've been saying for years. It is what it is.
I did a stream. It was probably about a week after he passed away.
Mm-hmm.
Saying, and it was another Car Thunder. It was called. It had a picture of Martin and Malcolm on one side,
Mm.
and then a picture of Kevin on the right side of the thumbnail.
I did see that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and the name of it was they hated they hated Martin and Malcolm too. You
Mm.
know,
Okay.
and see the thing I was watching Crimson Cure, and she mentioned something that I thought was interesting. Because folks will quote the one thing that they agree with that Malcolm said,
Mm-hmm.
right? But they don't say any of the hundreds and hundreds of things that if if they didn't like Kevin, they would have hated Malcolm,
Oh yeah.
and they would have hated Martin too,
Mm-hmm.
especially late period Martin.
You're right.
They would have hated both of them. So this sort of I put that out there, and of course I got some trolls in there,
Right.
and because people can't believe that. Oh, are you saying that the same? Well, they're all black men. They were all controversial figures. Um, you know, I I happen to believe that the impact of Kevin as things continue to progress potentially could be at the same level as a Martin and a Malcolm because of the long-standing uh, dysfunction in our community and voiceless people that he was a focal point for. And I think that with respect to, again, the dating market, uh, I mean, people that don't even have any idea of where the certain talking points and argumentation came from in
Mm-hmm.
all aspects of society, the conversation with respect to relationships has totally been transformed. It is not the same conversation anymore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It is not the same conversation. And yeah,
Well,
but
No, you're
Yeah.
right. It's not. Now, obviously with Martin and Malcolm, there was an open and direct political critique and statement put on the table. So I think the differentiation might be there. But here's the thing, with Kevin and his emphasis on relationships, his emphasis on men and their treatment and the entitlement of women is so unprecedented. I would argue we just don't have a visual vocabulary, for a Kevin. And truth be told, we might have not had one for a Malcolm or Martin until they came into being, right? Because I know by the time both men died, they were hated in America, Martin included. It was absolutely hated. It took years for him to, kind of be venerated as some kind of saint of sorts. And these things kind of happen after people die. With Kevin, you had something very similar. I mean, I don't think we have a frame of reference for Kevin, and people are fighting for what Kevin's legacy should be. We know men like ourselves are fighting for his relevance. One of the things we also saw after he passed is you had some women who were throwing celebration parties that he died. Some women talking about
Vivica A.
witchcraft.
Fox.
Yeah, yeah. Some celebrating, some throwing parties, some even talking about how they were supposedly practicing witchcraft and called for his death. I mean, and so this is where the fight is at this point. The legacy of Kevin, what that legacy should be, and what that says about the very ideas Black men are putting on the table. If he's successfully dismissed, then that means Black men's concerns are successfully dismissed. If he's venerated, and almost put on the level of a legend or mythic kind of figure, then so too are Black men's concerns heard. So the contestation right now for the memory of Kevin is really more about Black male voice and whatnot. And that's what's going on at this moment. There's a fight over how he should be remembered. And right after he passed, there was a strong push to have him dismissed. I mean, we saw articles in top newspapers and magazines, but in as much as they reported his death, they also denounced what he was saying. And then I would argue that within the next week to 2 weeks, the Manosphere fought back fiercely against some of this stuff. And a lot of people were shocked at how vehement many of us was that we were not going to let Kevin just be dismissed that way, because he's a reflection of us. He comes out of this discussion and he's been the voice for a lot of things we've been saying. We're not going to let you dismiss that. So that's what we're dealing with at this point.
So, we were talking politics a little bit earlier. You mentioned that you're an independent. I am too. And it's interesting because when I was a kid, Malcolm. That was the thing. I read his autobiography, and I had a big poster on my wall in my room, and
Yeah.
um,
Most of us read the autobiography. It changed our lives. Yeah.
yeah, and it wasn't just especially as a kid, a lot of the political stuff I wasn't able to fully grasp the magnitude of.
Right.
But I could grasp the swag, though. You know what I'm saying? Because in seeing that, maybe my favorite Spike Lee, well, my two probably favorite Spike Lee movies are Bamboozled and Malcolm X.
Mm-hmm.
And just that swag he had when one of his people was in the police station, and he marched those brothers out in front of the police station, and he's doing hand signals, and they're snapping into. I was like, dude,
yeah. Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
this is what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's just something about that that just really spoke to me. And over the course of my life, my politics have changed quite a bit,
Mm-hmm.
and have found myself sort of back where I began.
Okay.
Uh, uh, I guess I would title myself a black nationalist. Of course, that's a very diverse term. I mean, it means all kinds of different things.
Right.
But I would see myself as more of the sort of, after his sort of epiphany, going to Mecca,
Okay.
identifying with Malcolm more then. But I did another one of these streams, and it was called "Celebrating First Blacks Presupposes That the Racial Integrationists Were Right."
Okay.
And my whole point here was, it was right out of Malcolm's thinking. There's a sort of hypocrisy with sort of forcing people that are not on the same political, economic level to have to sit at the same table to, negotiate, right?
Okay.
Because in every circumstance, one of them is condescending,
Okay.
right? Because one of them has, doesn't need this conversation because they're not going to gain anything from this situation. And so Malcolm was all about the black community establishing itself and gaining some of that power itself, not with, asking for or trying to impose white society to do something, to give them a handout or something.
Okay.
But to achieve a certain level so that when we do come to the table, see, the thing is that when you're both at the same level, then the idea of integration never arises, because everyone is getting what they need in their current circumstance. And so anyhow, I'm saying this to say that we've had a number of these first blacks that are these symbolisms. It's symbols, but it doesn't actually do anything for our community. Ketanji Brown Jackson, Kamala Harris, Barack Obama. We've had a number of these that happen, and it seems to me that strategy that in particular the Democrats have used masterfully to like brainwash us or hypnotize us or something into not addressing or focusing on the real issues, because all of those things happened, but it has made zero difference in our community.
Okay.
So what do you think? I mean, I've said a bunch of stuff again, but what do you think about that?
So we're talking about firsts. Is that what you're asking? The question of black firsts?
Yeah. So my thing is that by celebrating someone as the first black this, the first black that, okay, that seems like a great thing. It seems like, okay, we're moving in a certain direction, but we're not, and we never have been. And using that strategy to give us a symbolic victory, while not actually addressing any of the real issues.
The deflection tactic, yeah.
Yeah, it's inherently problematic, it's disingenuous, it's phony, but it's super effective. It's super effective.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's happening in a lot of different spaces. And I think the gender divide in the black community on that is that many men are starting to argue your point. I mean, and I think this was kicked to a whole nother level. I think some of us saw it with Obama, but I think most of us were just so shocked that it was a black president. I mean, you grew up in our era. Black folk, when it came to the presidential election, the best you got was an Al Sharpton or somebody who would show up at a presidential debate, and he would put black issues in the debate. But you didn't really think he was going to win nothing. You know what I mean? Right. That changed a little bit when you started to, when you got to Barack. Now, all of a sudden, you started to see a momentum that we were not used to associating with black men. I mean, I remember the point where I was like, I heard some of the debates, but I dismissed him as I would any other. But by the time it dawned on me, he was putting that work to Hillary, and there might be a chance. I was like, hell. And I found it interesting that it was coming from, a black male who I'd never heard of before, up to a certain point. So anyway, that said,
came out of nowhere. Yeah.
It was, and we were so shocked about it. I think it made it difficult for us to critique what was going on, because I think in many ways I've argued this, that many of us voted once, especially once we saw he had a chance, just because of the optics. Meanwhile, I don't think black women really voted for Barack. I think they voted for Michelle, and Barack was a proxy for that. Because if he was with a white woman, I don't think they would have voted for him, to be honest with you. But that said, after that, when we saw what didn't happen with the black community after that, I mean, look, if I tell you that you're going to have the first white woman president or the first LGBT president, are you surprised if policy is advanced on the behalf of those demographics? You get the first black gay, I mean, the first gay candidate, no, the first gay president, and they start pushing policy for gay people, would that surprise you?
Nope.
It wouldn't surprise me, but how many policies did we actually see come out of Barack's presidency? Right? Barack was very much about a rising tide lifts all boats. We wanted very targeted and specific policy, and we didn't get to see that. So so by the time you get to, Kamala, many black men are just in a very different place about the optics of symbolic representation in electoral politics. It's like, yeah, it looks good, but what good is it if you put all this equity into voting and you leave with nothing? And so by the time we get to Kamala, many of us felt the same. But the difference between Kamala and a Barack is she had a track record in the Bay Area. I mean, I grew up in the Bay Area. I live in Central California. She had a track record when it came to, locking up black folk, particularly black men. I mean, she was one of the few that actually locked up black women whose kids weren't attending school regularly. I mean, this was a very different kind of thing. You really didn't have that with Barack. And yet you had many black women in the Democratic Party that were saying, shut up, shut up, push her in, vote for her. If you don't vote for her, you're a misogynist. And so it happened. She's there. What's changed for black folk?
Yeah, and it's the same thing. They talked a lot about reparations and stuff before they got in office, and then they get in office. Well, we can't really advocate for black people.
Right.
It can't really do that. Hey, let's do this. Let's get this anti-Asian or hate bill or hate crime, whatever that thing is. Mm-hmm. Let's get that in there. We got to do that. We need to do that.
Right.
It's like, come on, man. It's just the same stuff over and over. This stuff is just, it gets to a certain point where you're like,
what's the point?
Yeah, it is. What's the point? And it's like, you guys are still believing what these politicians are telling you.
Oh, yeah.
My whole point is, I say this over and over, Democrats and Republicans are jointly culpable for the state of the black community, and in particular, the nature of the issues in this country for black men and black boys. Right. They are jointly culpable for what's going on right now, and for either one of them to try to say, "Well, we're lesser, whatever." That's hogwash. Yeah. You guys had the power. You have a system that keeps basically all the same people in power. Because you don't have to be elected in order to be still, right there
mm-hmm.
At the reins of power, right? So, well, the Democrats are wrong. That means the Republicans must be right. And if the Republicans are wrong, then the Democrats must be right. And it's just this unending type of thing. And then there's all of this, you got to vote. You need to vote because, your ancestors died, for the right to vote, all of this kind of stuff that people say. And it's like, dude, but what am I voting for? This stuff is, it's totally ridiculous.
Yeah. And none of the parties really do, offer anything of substance. And I think, now you have hardcore conservative black men who can articulate why they vote the way they vote. Right now, I think there's a push for black men to vote in different ways, including for Republicans to an extent we really haven't in any close time period. But here's what I think will happen. I think some black men will try that because we're really looking for some kind of answer. And I don't think it's going to work any more than it has for voting for Democrats. I think you're going to have you're going to have a number of men who are just going to abstain politically altogether. And then you're going to have some that are going to push for a new kind of party framework. And this is one of the things I think I'm trying to do in my work where I'm saying, okay, we've developed what we call the Black male political agenda. And this is something that started on the Onyx Report, my show a couple of years in 220, before, the presidential election. We started having conversations about what is it Black men need? Because one of the things we noticed is every now and again, a political candidate would say, okay, well, what do you Black men want? And Black men who were interviewed would just give the generic line of things that would benefit the Black community as a whole, right? But when we noticed Black women were asked, they had very specific answers that were tied to their own advancement, not necessarily, the benefit of the Black community, but the benefit of them as a demographic unto themselves. And so when I started to push back and challenge men to actually tell me, what do you think would be something beneficial to Black men? What I realized, even for myself, was for many of them, this was the first time they'd ever been asked. You know what I mean? I just did a woman's show in LA. They affectionately call her Dr. Rosie, but I want to say she's in her 80s. And when she interviewed me, I took the time to ask her a question. I said, have you ever in your life, your 80 years of political activism and community involvement, have you ever heard of a Black male political agenda? And she got real quiet and she said, no, no, never heard of it. Now, I have 3 degrees in Africana studies. I've never heard of it. And, when I've talked to Black men, I've never heard of it. Now, I'm happy to be wrong because I would love to tap into what that list may have been at a different point in time and see if there's anything to learn from. But the fact that it's this hard for anybody to answer the question tells me that there's a significant, agenda here that needs to be supported that highlights, where we are and what Black men need. And I think it's relevant that we do so. But, my point simply is that it hasn't been developed in the past. And I think Black men are slowly reaching the point where they're accepting that there needs to be a change. I call it the Black masculinist turn, where men are being slapped in the face with the reality that the politics we've had since the 70s, where we've conceptualized a very particular way of being Black, a way of thinking about Blackness as a communal enterprise, has been irrevocably shifted by feminism. So Black men are generically pushing for a communal kind of sensibility, but you have many Black women that are really only about the advancement of Black women and girls. And this is one of the reasons I brought up my brother's keeper. I bring up Ice Cube on Cocktails with Queens. These moments where we have two different agendas, and the only people that are actually concerned about Black men are really nobody, because not even Black men advocate for themselves. Now, Black women will pay lip service to it, but what we see happening with BLM is a clear indication that Darren Seals was right a number of years ago, that this was all a performance that had everything to do with performing a certain Black politic while exploiting the Black community, benefiting off the deaths and blood of Black men, producing no policy whatsoever that actually changed the situation for those very Black men dying. If anything, there was a bait and switch to a whole different sexuality agenda that had nothing to do with why these Black men were dying in the streets, unless you start to talk about heterosexual Black men as a sexuality under threat, which is what people like James Sedanius did, Errol Miller did, Anthony Lamell did, Tommy Curry did, myself is doing. Unless you start talking about that, then, for many Black men, sexuality is irrelevant to why they're dying in the streets, or they're massively unemployed or ignored institutionally. And in the last 3 years, we've seen a bevy of programs that came forth to highlight the needs of Black women as entrepreneurs, as Black women going into STEM, Black women needing employment, hell, even city-based programs where Black women would get money just for being single mothers in the Black community. But nothing for Black men. Whether you're talking about the $10 billion that Goldman Sachs dedicated to pushing Black women through STEM, or whether you're talking about city-based programs like in San Francisco, where they're providing $1,000 a month so people can eat. None of that being targeted at Black men. And so Black men are getting tired of it. So in other words, you have this collective of Black women that benefit from a pro-Black dialogue, especially one that's politically, framed. It advances them on one level, but then there's also a program that talk about Black women's advancement. They benefit from both. But Black men are finding out they don't benefit from either. The generic conversations about benefiting the Black community don't include them And then, of course, the Black women specific programs don't include them. So why?
Yeah, well, when the politicians say black family, they're not talking about black men.
Not at all.
And
Not at all.
I did a stream where I the title of it is because the boys will become men. And so my argument is that it's not just about removing sort of the men from consideration. It's also about removing the boys, because the boys will become men.
Yeah.
Right. So it becomes a hyper focus on black women and girls.
Mm-hmm.
Now I have this as part of my multi thunder overlay.
All right.
The bottom of the screen here. One of them says black men are perfect, and that's O'Shea Duke Jackson's his merch.
Right.
And it's interesting because in the sort of pushback against sort of positive sort of assessments of black men, no one seems to have those same issues with things like black girl magic.
Oh.
And the thing is that neither statement is they're both hyperbolic, right? They're not intended to represent, actual reality. They're
not literal.
Right. They're not literal. But it seems to me that more folks would have issues with black men are perfect than black girl magic. And the last time I tested or that I checked, I think black women are relatively underrepresented as magicians.
Okay.
And
that's one way to put it.
Yeah, and though they're aforementioned, you were talking about how some of these witches, I guess, were cursing Kevin to die.
Mm-hmm.
But other than a very small percentage, it seems like witchcraft is not a high, a high representation amongst black women. But we don't look at it that way. But rather, we analyze the black men are perfect. We say, hey, but hold up, nobody's perfect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It seems like, and it's not just the women, it's the men that do that. And shout out to Mr. Palmer. He would call them simp enforcers.
Okay.
There's a lot of that. There's a lot of black men acting in ways that are against their own interest, protecting the sort of status quo, the way that things are. Now, to that point, who is there's a black feminist that did a video. He's got a bunch of subscribers on YouTube. BGS did a response. I think who else did a response to his video?
Are you talking about
You did. I think you did. Also
FD
did.
Signifier or something like that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and also folks like who's the guy that did some sort of hit pieces on the Manosphere? What's his name?
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. His name escapes me though.
Yeah. So it seems like we're never. There's always plenty of those, simp enforcers running around trying to protect the status quo.
And it's
what is it going to?
It's understandable why. No, just real quick. It's understandable why, because even on YouTube, if you cater to white men or women, or if you cater to black women, there are resources tied to that. Because if you look at that Signifier cat, one of his channels, he's almost at 300,000 subs. And most of his audience, as I'm told, I can be wrong about this, are white or they're feminists, because he strikes me as an as a intersectional feminist. But if you're talking about black men, you're not necessarily going to make as much money. I mean, even Kevin Samuels, who you and I, we've been familiar with his work for years, Kevin didn't break out into the mainstream until he started incorporating interviews with women. But as
Yep.
long as he was talking about black men, his numbers were relatively low. So it's not a lucrative enterprise to be in the manosphere. There's only a few people that are making something we might call, good money, but even those guys are not getting the kind of, mainstream presence that they want. I mean, the kind Kevin was getting, where you had, he was on the show Atlanta, he was doing music videos with people like Future, you know what I mean? That happened for one individual. So that said, a lot of these, as you call them, simp enforcers, there's money to be made. Again, I said this is, Forbes magazine that identifies 70 to 80% of consumer purchases are driven by women. So, there's money in holding a position that's antithetical to what men are starting to wake up to. And in that way, you're almost like a paid agent and getting patted on the head, as it were, like a mascot, especially by feminists and, by whites. It comes with resources. You become a mouthpiece for a set of politics that, are useful for your own advancement, but maybe not as useful for black men who are trying to find a voice outside of what we've already done. And that's where
See,
we
and
are.
that's in that very issue that you just said. That's the issue that I have with most of the racial integrationists,
Okay.
because many of them started out as being more black nationalists, really focused on let's do things. I need quantifiables. I need stuff that actually is going to help the situation of the black community. And
Mm-hmm.
then because they personally could gain something by adopting this more racial integrationist sort of position, they did so.
Mm-hmm.
And they benefited greatly from it, but our community obviously did not.
Right. Yeah. It's an approach that is primed for tokenization, right? As long as you hold these positions, you will advance. Just say what we want you to say, and you'll see your income rise, your notoriety will rise in certain circles. And this, of course, is something you and I are familiar with in the academy. You know,
Yeah.
if you are willing to throw black men under the bus, you can watch your career develop. You can watch your advancement kind of take place. It's something I've seen with a number of scholars who, are highly regarded, but much of it is because they've been willing to throw black men under the bus. And it's at now, if you start advocating for black men, now that's a whole different conversation. And what you'll tend to find is that your career may be in question. And, as a matter of fact, if you start doing it before you get tenure, you may not be able to, advance as a scholar. If you do it after you get tenure, you may not be able to leave wherever you are. And these are the realities of talking about black men in, professional settings.
Let alone getting labeled as a misogynist because
Yes.
you even had the audacity to advocate for black men and boys.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it doesn't even matter in terms of what your argument is. Look, I've had graduate students who have asked me to be on their dissertation committees simply because they've almost been kicked out of their programs for citing me or citing Dr. Tommy Curry. I've seen black men who've had Tommy Curry's Zoom lecture a class get fired simply because he was present, and some people didn't like what he had to say, but nothing he had to say did he not provide citations for. I myself almost, I had a class of students at another university I was teaching at as a favor for a friend. They tried to get me, the students tried to get me fired. And this is before I developed the concept of Black masculinism. But I taught, in this intro class to Africana studies, I taught, the origins of Black feminism. I taught the origins of Black womanism, and Africana womanism. And I didn't have a concept for black men. All I did is put statistics on the board. Statistics around everything from homelessness to circumcision to pay gap to incarceration rates. They tried to get me fired. The black women in my class tried to get me fired simply for putting data on the board that they didn't like. You know, this is where we are.
Goodness gracious.
Yeah, man.
Speaking of numbers, and this is a stat that I I heard also on one of your streams. You could have been on BGS's channel. I mean, I watch you, Green Gorilla, BGS, Dr. Ronald Neal. I watch you guys, frequently. A
Likewise.
lot of, yeah, a lot of, a lot of information. Great stuff. But 2/3 of the slaves were men.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to know. Okay, and I think at some point in my reading, I probably saw a table with some numbers on it and just went by it and didn't think about it.
Right.
But when you consider, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
that just seems like such a glaring sign of something.
Right.
Like, why would you not disaggregate the
Man.
numbers to point that out?
Man.
Why is that never discussed?
Look, man, like I said, I did 3 degrees in Africana studies. I never once heard any of my professors say it. The first time I heard it was from Claude Anderson, and he was giving a lecture that BGS actually put that section of in his video. And I'm telling you, I mean, it was just an average day. I was listening to different YouTube content creators, bouncing around, running errands. That it was like a 5-minute clip, knocked me on my ass. I'm sitting there with a doctorate. I'm a tenured professor of Africana studies. I have 3 degrees in the field. I had never once heard anybody say anything about the numbers, the data, because part of it, again, the majority of the faculty in the field and in the academy, as far as Black folk are concerned, are women. So, there's a lot of pandering. There's a lot of, especially in Africana studies, there's a lot of pandering to women, Black feminists, and this goes from within, the institutions to publishers. There's a lot of pandering to that in that sense. And so, I'm hearing this, and the implications of why this hasn't been said begin to smack me in the face, and I'm just blown away. And when you really begin to look at it, one of the things Dr. Anderson pointed out is you really didn't get Black women coming to North America in any large numbers until about 1808, 1809, somewhere around there. So what's interesting about that is he's basically letting us know the majority of Black women don't even come here and experience slavery until about 50 years before slavery's formal end, right? So from 1619 to really about 1808, 1809, it's way majority male. And as far as they were concerned, you worked, men to death, and then you replaced them. You didn't cultivate an enslaved caste, you worked them to death. The only reason there was a push to really begin to develop a group, a caste that could be homegrown on a plantation, came about in the late 18th century, where it was becoming illegal for slavers to travel the waters. So they had to, they had to actually develop a slave caste here rather than just working them to death. And that's where you had slave owning states that really began to push for Black women so that they could grow their own enslaved populations right there on their own plantations. This was virtually unheard of prior to that. So it took until, a random YouTube clip from BGS for me to even learn about this. And I was incensed, I was pissed, but it really also let me know how politicized my education, even within Africana studies, was to suit the sensibility of Black women, because Black feminists for years have been arguing that they haven't been, their experience hasn't been acknowledged enough, especially in regard to slavery. And there's really been a strong doubling down on how Black women were raped, during slavery, sexually violated. And so so it's very political. They chose that. But here's the problem with that. They framed rape as something that mainly only Black women experienced during enslavement. It took until the works of Tommy Curry for me to find out just how often the sexual violation of men took place in much the same way. But here's the difference. It took place not only with white women who used vigilante violence against Black men to justify sexual violation. In other words, the threat of being lynched by a lynch
Yep.
mob to, for your complicity. So white women would tell you, if you don't have sex with me, I'm going to say you raped me. That's a death sentence, especially,
Yep.
during the era of slavery, but all the way up through the 20th century, in the mid 20th century, most particularly, it was a death sentence, right? So that was a coercion that Black men could not sidestep very easily. But not only were they violated by Black women, they were also sexually violated by white men, simply because they could be. So here you have an experience where the sexual violation and vulnerability of Black men and boys is taking place not only by white men, but by white women. But we're only allowed to really talk about the sexual violation of women because that's the hold that they had over the over enslavement, and the value it had in the academy was rooted in something that only they could talk about. So as long as that's the dynamic, you can see how politicized aspects of African American history become when it comes to the advancement of Black women and girls in the field. And so this again becomes something that I'm completely oblivious to until just the last few years. And as we started looking at it, we started talking about how enslavement was rooted in choosing mostly men, how it was rooted in exploiting men, and how the majority of the slave era was targeted at Black men. And once you really begin to frame it along those lines, the implications are ridiculous. And if you look at Tommy Curry's work, he did a recent paper, I think in the last 2 years, about racism being a misandric aggression, meaning
Yep.
this falls in line with James Sedanius's work, where Black men are targeted. And it's not just something Black men are saying. This is empirically measurable, that Black men are targeted from everything from racist violence by vigilantes or during the slave era all the way to now, or even in terms of something like, this is going back to Sedanius's work, how much they're charged for cars on a dealership lot, how they're priced out of certain industries, or how they're not employed versus women, right? These kinds of microaggressions, as it were, begin to play out in Black male life, but we're not allowed to talk about it because most of the time we're given this gender neutral version of Black life in the field of Africana studies
Right.
itself. But when we do talk
Right.
about gender, you can only talk about Black women and girls, or LGBT, right? That's the newest edition. So you can talk about gender as it relates to women and LGBT, and that's it, right?
Right.
So that becomes a problem.
Yeah. No disaggregating of the numbers when it
No,
would actually show some impropriety with respect to Black men and boys.
right,
Yeah.
right. And
Oh
this
my
too,
goodness.
this too, I think adds. So I talked about Black men's frustrations, right? The dissatisfaction of how we're treated in families and relationships. But now you have a different camp that's growing. And these are educated Black men, or Black men in the academy, that are starting to understand that they've been lied to there, even in spaces that we thought were liberatory in its orientation and centered around uplifting Black communities. Black students, young Black men, are finding themselves being lied to then, even by Black male professors who were taught the same things we're talking about and refused to relinquish any of it to entertain any new ideas. These young Black men are reaching out to me and they are pissed. And I mean pissed. But, this is where we are.
It's a lot of money to spend if they're not going to at least be honest with you.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So, I mean, why the constant dismissal of our concerns? Why the constant dismissal of our concerns? Why is it? Why is it seen as a threat? Why? I mean, isn't this whole sort of equality thing? Isn't it bigger than if I try to achieve equality? That means that I'm taking away from you. Can it just be? Why the constant dismissal of our concerns?
Well, I think as far as white society is concerned, the dismissal is rooted in an unwillingness to deal with reparations, an unwillingness to deal with, and I mean that both in terms of the reparations argument, formally speaking, but also informally, where you just have an overall bent toward repairing past grievances. I think people don't generally want to do that. The resources are staggering. If you go into those reparations discussions, all of that is, by the way, was exacerbated by the pandemic, where we found out that they can manufacture millions, if not billions, of dollars when they want to. When it comes to reparations, it's too much. And you'll hear that a lot,
That's right.
even from people like Bernie Sanders. That's too much. It's unrealistic. But it wasn't unrealistic during the pandemic, right? Um, you know, but I think what they found is the cheaper option was to pay Black women. And I know that sounds egregious off the bat, but the reality is, if you can pay Black women and they're satisfied with it, and they themselves will silence Black men, then that's a much that's a discounted kind of rate of thing. So I think that's a factor. I think the silencing and the dismissal among the Black community, especially in regard to how Black women regard Black males' concerns, is rooted in her own. This is an opportunity for her own advancement. I've called this like a political coup that's been going on and been ramping up since, most particularly, the 1970s. Some might argue the 60s, but it's been ramping up. So if you take, for example, the push for Kamala Harris a little while ago, you saw how intense it was, right? Where you had people coming forward saying, we got to have a Black woman VP. We got to have, and the arguments that would take place, even against Black men who, didn't have a problem with Kamala herself, but didn't want to vote Democrat. You saw the intensity that it went beyond what we normally would hear in many ways, because the push to have Black women's representation is there. Now, I do think that in some respects was a bait and switch about anything tangible, but for Black women, it was about advancing themselves politically. Even if Kamala was not going to be as supportive as another Black candidate might have been, because Kamala's identification with her Asian parentage is a little more pronounced in
She's
my
not
opinion.
FBA.
No, she's not. She's not. And she doesn't claim to be, she doesn't, but she will perform those politics. She'll pull that AKA badge out in a minute when it comes to getting votes. But not even anything really tangible for Black women. But my point here is simply that that's just a symbolic kind of moment. But if you look at that from the hiring of Black women, the election of Black women judges and low-level politicians, what I think we've been witnessing in the last couple of decades is a sort of political coup, where it's not necessarily anti-Black male. It's actually, Black males are irrelevant as far as they're concerned, right?
There's
And
that apathy that you
yeah,
mentioned from
yeah,
before.
they're Black men are irrelevant to their political aspirations. And if you speak up for Black males, now you become an impediment to their political aspirations. So that's when it becomes somewhat of a problem. But at the end of the day, it doesn't consider Black males at all. It's all about this myopic, solipsistic push for Black women to get in positions of authority. And when you listen to these women talk about their aspirations, they only really talk about benefits for other Black women and girls. It's not communal in its orientation. It's very specific to other Black women and girls. That's why I call it myopic and solipsistic, where nothing else exists outside of her and her aspirations. And so this becomes problematic, but it ends up taking the form of a kind of political coup of Black women, looking to be in positions of authority that benefit each other, and do so really at the expense of Black males. But in many ways, I question how much of it is intentional and how much of it is. I mean, if you ask them or challenge them on the measure, they'll tell you, that this is a disruption for what they're trying to do. But I think many of them don't even think about Black men. Even their own sons, even their own brothers, their own husbands. It's irrelevant to them. It's about their advancement and really beginning to tap into power, but irrelevant of Black men. And it's causing a massive split in the community that we don't have a language for, that the Manosphere is instrumental in developing, but we haven't had a language for, which is why since the 80s, there's been so much confusion. I mean, we grew up in a time period where the rash of these books and movies were coming out. Women were just saying, well, I don't see the problem. They're talking about things that we've experienced. Why are you so upset? But men were just kind of like, well, we don't have a collective voice, but this shit is wrong. And y'all are going somewhere with this that doesn't make any sense. I mean, we're seeing book after book and movie after movie and television talk show after television talk show. What's the point? Where is this going? I mean, it would be one thing if it just happened in isolation, but it's happening in this, successive kind of framework. And we were always like, where is this going? What we didn't know was that when you started to see the push for Black women in college and universities, the push for white collar employment at the same time, you had the war on drugs where Black males were going to jail, it diminished Generation X dramatically in terms of our presence in the workplace, our presence in families. And then you saw the push move to the political. All of this speaks to a very targeted Black women's political coup at the expense of Black men and boys, and one that white society has no problem bankrolling because it split the community. I mean, you're never going to have a civil rights moment. And as much as some people may dismiss the civil rights, keep in mind, the civil rights moment was the last time we saw Black America where Black folk, regardless of age, so across age, across class, across region, across occupation, across sexuality, across skin color, across hair texture, came together and said, we are a Black, component. We are an entity. We're a Black community that requires that the U.S. government do some things for us. We've not seen that since. I mean, the closest we got to it after that might have been, the push to divest from South Africa in the late 80s. You got a little bit of it after the death of Rodney King. But after that, we get the rise of BLM 2015 or so, 2014, about 2015, we see the rise of BLM. And that becomes the whole bait and switch about, feminism, intersexual feminism, and, gender ideology. We don't see that collective Black entity anymore. And that's the point. So you give Black women baubles and, Black men still don't know what the hell to say. And that's enough. And I think that was the old playbook for the last 50 years. And it's really been working. But now you got these Black men who are using these free platforms to articulate themselves. And I think some shit has changed that we can't pretend doesn't exist anymore. And brothers are pissed. They are pissed.
Yeah, and and I mentioned this earlier, the end game for all of this stuff is divestment.
Mm.
That's the end game.
Mm.
And we're seeing a rise of these divester groups. I mean, you can go on Clubhouse, you can go on, YouTube. You see all kinds of stuff on Twitter, and the thing is a lot of the kind of anti-Black male sort of sentiment and statements. We're used to seeing that stuff, but not with such sort of frequency and aggression.
Yeah.
From Black women.
Yeah.
And that makes me really sad. I mean, I sent you a message saying that because JoJo, a Black woman named JoJo, was on your thing, and she got on there and she was going in.
Mm-hmm.
She was going in on the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And it was. I didn't realize how much I needed that. Right. Just after some of the divester stuff that I had been watching, I'm like, oh my goodness, like, because my son is 8, and I'm thinking, this is the kind of stuff that he has to look forward to. I mean, this is just like, it just really, really made me. I kind of went to a dark place.
Yeah.
But seeing that, and I was in on the live stream when that happened.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a reason why there's a sort of a rising number of women in the space, and they get subscribers pretty easily, and maybe we should be a little like protective of and be careful about that, because I think because there is a deep love for Black women,
mm-hmm.
I think it makes Black men particularly susceptible to a Black woman coming in, and maybe she actually doesn't believe the stuff that she's saying.
Yeah. Well, and especially if she's cute, or has a sexy voice. Right. I think what you said about our emotional, kind of response to this, just like you said, how you needed to hear from JoJo. we're raised in a gynocracy, man. Most of us, especially with our generation, were raised in female-led households, which means that from birth, your very life was dependent upon a woman's mood. Whether you're talking about, whether she fed you from her own breast or not, you know what I mean? Our very sustenance was tied to her emotional well-being. So seeking approval from women is a much different thing in the Black community for Black men than it might be in other communities for other groups of men. We have a different relationship with our women, like it or not. And the reality of it is, much of it is tied to her approval. So it does something to Black men to hear a Black woman in the space espousing some of the same ideas. And we've caught a few grifters at different moments who've tried to do it. And we're still way more forgiving than I think we probably should be. But part of it is because of that legacy, that history, and it does something to us. But a lot of the divester thing too, I want to point out, I think is very much, a kind of response, as it were, to SYSBM, a kind of get back, a kind of, we don't need you kind of thing. But here's the problem. When you start talking about these divestors, realistically speaking, statistically speaking, there's no other group that want Black women more than Black men, especially if you're talking about FBA, ADOS. There's no other group that wants Black women, but as much as Black men. Now, Black men, on the other hand, we tend to be sought after, but I would argue that's fraught with difficulty too. I've yet to run into men who go into other communities and marry that don't have to deal with racism from families, the families of the women that they're with, the family, the communities they're in. We have to deal with racism. We have to deal with stereotypes. I mean, I took a trip to Korea in college, and and they thought we were nothing but gangsters and rappers. It is what it is. A lot of it has to do with global representation. But the point is, Black men deal with racism in relationships with other communities, but women of other communities will still entertain us, even if it starts out as a sexual fantasy or a sexual kind of fetish. It can then shift into something more substantive just when you have contact and long-term dialogue. But you have, the difference there is that the perspective on Black women is very different. And I think other groups of men will entertain them sexually sometimes, but not necessarily in terms of marriage. So you have a split there. And, so it's at a point where these divesting versus SYSBM discussions will tend to bode worse off for Black women than men. And so thus it falls to Black women to actually verbalize an appreciation for Black men. And we're not really seeing the vestiges of that. I mean, there was some kind of push for Black men during the pandemic, but to what
I mean,
extent?
you're hearing you're hearing from these divestors, a lot of these divestors, you're hearing them, you get pregnant, you find out what the sex of the baby is. If it's a boy, abort it.
Yeah, yeah, you don't hear
That
that from
kind of
Black
stuff.
men. Black men aren't saying
Right.
that. Even when
No.
they're talking about SYSBM and going other places, you're not hearing them say abort Black girls. You're not. And that's the difference between Black male studies and Black feminism. Notice that, and that's the difference between Black masculinism and Black feminism. Black men are not talking about killing, getting rid of, and they're just saying, you know what, we're tired of being mistreated. That's a very different thing than what we're hearing in some of these circles by women, especially if you've been on Clubhouse. The divestiture discussions on Clubhouse are, I mean, they're laughing at Black men who've gotten killed. They're talking about how they want to sexually be with the police officers that are killing these men because those police officers are real men. I've heard Black men say some, pretty ridiculous stuff, even in the Manosphere, about Black women, but I have yet to hear them really talking at that level, you know. But hey,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, this has been a great conversation. I, thank you very much for your time and energy. Again, thank you for your tireless advocating for Black men and boys. And it's not just the stuff that you're doing, uh, you know, academically. It's not just the stuff you're doing on YouTube. It's not just the stuff that you're doing, through your institute. but all the stuff all the posts, the frequent posts I see on Twitter, on Facebook, all of the stories that I see you posting, daily posting of a lot of stuff all day long, all of this stuff that you're doing, very much appreciate all that you're doing for us.
Wow. Well, that means a lot, man. I appreciate that.
All right, man.
All right, man. Thanks a lot.
All right, see you.